So this week, Parshat Bo, remember when we had Bo Nose, Bo Jackson, but this was Parshat Bo, and Bo means come to Pharaoh, and it represents a change in the relationship where it was no longer go to Pharaoh in the sense of intruding into a space in which you have no jurisdiction. Rather, it was come to Pharaoh as if the palace has now become the centerpiece of inviting in Moses, where God is now speaking to Moses as though, come on, this is your new home. Move in and go to Pharaoh. Don't feel like an outsider. You're now an insider. You've had the upheaval that you've wanted. You've totally paralyzed Egypt, and they're thinking really hard about letting you go and keep going. Don't give up. And if you go through the portion of Bo, I think it's just worth noting, there's a few things that really stand out for me. The first thing is, was it trickery, what they were asking? Did they say that we are leaving and never coming back, or did they say they just want to go 3 days and do a festival in the desert, with the implication being they were coming back? Or did they in fact say they were going to go away for 3 days, but once Pharaoh chased after them, that was impossible? Or was this just a ploy to get away, and frankly, who could blame them? That's part one. The other thing that I want you to look at, if you get a chance, is the entire dialogue about matzah. They were told to eat matzah at the Seder and to act as though it was bread of poverty, and you're probably familiar with the dual narrative of matzah. Bread of poverty, part of the scenery that was acted out the night before Exodus was the eating of matzah. And the next day, when they left with dough on their back and they didn't have time to let it rise, and they baked it in the hot sun, that was also a source narrative of matzah. So there's two narratives of matzah, but we have to remember that when we eat matzah on Passover, it's not just one or the other. They're both there, and it really creates a large dimensionality about the meaningfulness of matzah. It's both about the Seder that happened before Exodus and about what happened after Exodus. Not as many people imagine it. It's all about post-Exodus. And then, randomly, in the middle of the portion, there's an interjection in which God says to Moses, this is the first month of the Jewish calendar, of your new calendar. This is why Nisan is considered the Rosh Hashanah for festivals. It is the new year for the Jewish calendar, not Rosh Hashanah that we know that comes in the fall. That's the Rosh Hashanah for the world. But Rosh Hashanah for the festival starts in the month of Nisan. And it's the first festival, in fact, would be Passover. Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot. Those are the three major pilgrimage festivals in the Torah. And this little interjection in the portion references that. There's instructions about how to eat the Passover lamb. And then we get to the portion we read today, after the conversation about putting the blood on the doorposts and the angel of death, that it starts to happen. The death of the firstborn. And I will tell you, and this is a little throwaway line, but if we had time, I could spend a week talking about a different version of the 10 plagues as they were supposed to be versus the 10 plagues that happened because they were managed by Moses, who had a vendetta against Pharaoh. And in my postulation, the 10th plague was not supposed to be the death of the firstborn. It was in fact supposed to be something quite different. That's a whole long topic. Maybe we'll get a chance one day to study Torah and look through the story of Passover with a whole different eye, and it's all text-based. But then you have the beginning of the Exodus. Pharaoh comes to Moses, please get out of my land. All of you, everybody just go and don't look back. Get out of here, we're all going to die. And they leave. And then we get to where they're now camping at the sea, and that's next week's portion. And of course, Pharaoh changes his mind, and that's really where the whole destruction of Egypt comes from. So today I want to talk about one of the most interesting things that you may not know about what happens the night of the death of the firstborn. So last week, I had talked about limiting our joy, avoiding Schadenfreude, not celebrating unbridled joy over the death of our enemies because they are fundamentally people. And the story of God saying to the angels, don't celebrate too much because that's my handiwork, those are my creations, and they're drowning. How dare you celebrate with unbridled joy? And that's why we recite the short Hallel on Passover. Another example, and this might shock you. You might know that on Erev Pesach, the day of Passover Eve, the 13th, what happens? If you're a firstborn Jewish male, you may be familiar with the tradition of fasting. That on the day before Passover, you fast because you're a firstborn Jewish male. And what's that all about? Why do firstborn have to fast? Typically, in shul, under normal circumstances, we'd have a minyan, and all the firstborns would join the minyan. And why would they join? Because we do something quirky at the end of the minyan that saves them from fasting. So they have an obligation to fast. At the end of the service, somebody, possibly me or someone else, will finish the study of a tractate of Talmud or Mishnah. So when you finish studying a tractate, an entire book of Talmud, you make a siyum, you make a celebratory party. It's not a big party, but it involves getting your closest 10 friends together, have a minyan, say a special kaddish when you're done, not a mourner's kaddish, but a celebratory kaddish of completion and a commitment to return. And once you have a siyum and a celebration for a book of Talmud, well, what follows is a meal. Of course you have to have a meal. How else do you celebrate? And since the fast of the firstborn is a rabbinic imposition, and the obligation to have a siyum is a rabbinic obligation, the two kind of balance each other out. So if you are a firstborn, you're supposed to fast, but if you have a siyum and you have an obligation to participate in a meal of joy and celebration and festivity for completing a tractate, it wipes out your obligation to fast. And that is how you fast and then you unfast. But still, the question is, why did you have to fast in the first place? And the answer is, all firstborn should have died that day. Why did the Hebrews survive? Well, maybe they weren't responsible. But maybe not all the Egyptian firstborn were responsible. Maybe they were just under a tyrannical reign and they had no choice. Well, to offset the joy that we have of salvation and Exodus, the firstborns have taken upon themselves to recognize their firstborn brothers and set aside a time to acknowledge their death and recognize, but for the grace of God, go we. Again, another way in which we throttle our sense of superiority, and we recognize that it was a quirk of history and fate that allowed us to survive as firstborns, and therefore we shouldn't be so excited that we ignore history, and the reality is we have to give of ourselves to acknowledge a terrible, terrible story. As a matter of fact, it was so terrible that the Midrash tells us that the day in which the plague of the firstborn was supposed to be visited upon Egypt, there were a massive revolt in Egypt of the firstborns who didn't want to die. They believed, after watching 9 plagues come and go, that when Moses said such and such is going to happen on such and such a day, it was going to happen. And they believed themselves to be under a death watch, and they revolted. They insisted, let them go. And they stormed the palace. And it was a war. They didn't want to die. And Pharaoh held steadfast. And they died. Ein bayit asher ein sham met. There was not a single home where somebody had not died. Except for who? Who was the only firstborn that we know of that survived? Wouldn't you know, it was Pharaoh. So here you have a story in which a national conversation about the Hebrews turns into a death watch for the firstborn, and they revolt, and they're just a little bit too late. Because by the time they revolted, Pharaoh could stave them off for one more day, and by midnight they were all dead. This story sounds pretty archaic. It's old, it's history, happened a very long time ago. But yet we're still fasting. And yes, we have the shtick with the siyum, but that's lovely. The point is, we didn't get rid of it. Here we are, over 3,000 years later, and what are we doing? We're fasting for the Egyptians who died mercilessly at the hand of a tyrant called Pharaoh. We fast for them because they can't fast for themselves. Think about that. This, to me, actually, is one of those moments in which religion, the so-called religion of Judaism, like prayer and synagogue, can be transcended by this deep empathy to history, not to each other today, but to all of history. We can roll back the clock on so much that has been clouded over by our own sense of persecution, and turn around and look at religion in the face and say, it's not about prayer, it's not about getting together in a minyan, it's about the fact that we as a Jewish people remember the suffering even of our enemy tormentors, because there were many among them who would have been innocent. That takes a lot of courage. That's one of the things that makes me proud to be Jewish, is that we have the capacity to turn around and say, we still care for you. Not for what you did, not for those who hurt us, but for you and you and you, absolutely. This is why the stories that we get from Israel all the time about Syrian refugees and people from Lebanon and Gaza being treated in Israeli hospitals with respect. How is that even possible? You're the enemy. But no. And this kind of compassion and empathy that we see all over comes deeply rooted in a very small tradition called the fast of the firstborn. We set aside our triumphalism. We set aside the religion to create one of the highest ethical values, and that is deliberate empathy for those for which it is unexpected. Now, why is this important to me today? It's important to me because what's happening now in the Jewish world is almost unspeakable. What's happening in the Jewish world is that, as Rabbi Slifkin puts it, rabbis have blood on their hands. They are murdering their adherents. I talked about, way back at the beginning of pandemic, beware of leaders who are cruel to their followers. There are massive weddings taking place, massive celebrations. I mean, massive, over thousands of people, in which not a single mask was visible, and people are living in defiance of regulations. And governments are struggling. How do you shut them down? They're a huge political bloc, they're influential, and they just refuse. And people in their community are dying. I have no hesitation in saying, if they plan to kill off their brightest and greatest, their elderly, their leaders, this couldn't have been a better plan. Just get the old rabbi sick with corona, boom, you'll have a successor in no time. What's happening, and the rate of infection over 20% or over 25% in various places in Israel, it is terrible. It is cold-blooded murder. But I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, those Orthodox. There are many, 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 many Orthodox who themselves are beyond perplexed as to what is this that is driving the sects of Judaism to defy rules, defy logic, and literally die for their disavowal of science and regulation. And maybe you remember at the beginning of COVID when some people were saying, I don't know anyone who died from COVID. Do you know anyone who died from COVID? Well, here's today. It's the end of January. Do you know anyone who died from COVID? You probably do now. In Israel, 10,000 deaths. Well, they probably know someone who died from COVID. Small country. Yes, they have a very high rate of vaccine delivery. But that doesn't speak to all the other issues they've had and all the other internal dissensions and communities who refused lockdown, refused to follow the rules. And here, in this country, it's easy to make fun of our government and say, we have 1.67% of the population inoculated. Well, I'm not defending anyone, but I'm saying this is what you got. Stop complaining, be supportive, because we all got to get out of this together. It's no longer we're in the same boat. Either you row and get us to the shore, or we're going to sink. So if you don't want to row, that's fine. Why don't you stop being dead weight and get off the boat? We all need to get to the shore, and when we're on land and we're settled, and we have food, and we have friendship, and we have love, and we have compassion, and we have the ability to get on with life, and this is over, then you can have a commission of inquiry, you can complain, you can vote, you can do whatever you want. You can throw the bums out of office. Who cares? Do what you want. But if you're not going to row, get off. Even if you don't want to row, that's what we're doing. We are going to the shore. Please come with us. Stop talking. Now, I understand what's going on in that Orthodox community, those ultra-Orthodox communities, and there's large pockets of them. There's Bobov, and there's Vizhnitz, and there's Satmar, and there's Spinker, and there's all kinds. And then there's Litvish, the Lithuanian Jewish, the Peleg movement. And then there's Lakewood, and there's Borough Park, and there's Williamsburg, and it's everywhere. And do I need to tell you what's going on in Los Angeles right now? Forget the Orthodox community. Los Angeles, you know that if a Jewish person dies, they could wait up to 4 weeks to be buried? It's unheard of. Doctors are so busy, they don't even have time to sign death certificates. California is being destroyed. And sure, vaccination will happen as soon as there's a plan, which hopefully there will be. The United States will have to really, really get on it because they're incredibly vulnerable. They're the highest number of cases around the world. And like I say, if you don't want to row, please, just get off the boat. So why are they doing this? Why are rabbis murdering their adherents? Why are rabbis telling their sycophants and their Hasidim to open boys and girls' schools? Why are rabbis telling teenagers to get back to Torah learning? Why are men and women going to classes? Why are there weddings without masks? Why is everything happening in defiance of science and law? I'll tell you why. One of the most romantic notions, the dark romantic notion of Orthodox life, is that you can die al Kiddush Hashem, which means that you die to sanctify God's name. And I'm not talking about people who died in the Holocaust who were murdered. They absolutely died for sanctification of the name in the sense they died purely because they were Jewish, and their lives are considered pure and holy no matter what, because they were martyred. But to die al Kiddush Hashem is this high, deeply disturbing, romantic ideal where your life ends purposefully. You don't just pass on. You don't just pager. You don't just drop dead. You leave in a blaze of glory of God, which is supposedly what you've been doing your whole life. You've been serving God, and here God takes you in a purposeful way. It's a blaze of glory. It's an opportunity. And so, some of them say to themselves, let me die in a grand way. COVID schmovid, God is taking me publicly. I will be known. I will be noted. I will be listed. All I have to do is not wear a mask. And I too could be on the rolls of those who died for sanctification in defiance of law and science. There's a survivor mentality. There are those who are taking the risk to keep their mask off, so when it's over and they're vaccinated, they can then turn around and say, you see, God saved me. I'm willing to take the risk of dying from COVID because if I don't die, I then know that God saved me and put me here for a purpose. So there's the death of glory, and then there's the chosenness. I was chosen. Out of the million people who were going to die, I was not among them. I survived. I didn't survive randomly. I was chosen to remain. And how can I prove that I was chosen? I didn't wear a mask. I defied the authority. I did everything the Rebbe told me. The Rebbe died, but I didn't. The Rebbe's wife died, but mine didn't. We didn't die. We were left here for a purpose. We are the new vanguard. We are the vanguard that were newly chosen by God in 2021. God had a new covenant with His beloved true people. And by not removing me from the world, it's proof that I'm intended to be the future. This is the Exodus narrative. The Exodus narrative was, if we survive as a firstborn, when all the firstborn were to be destroyed, but the firstborn of Israel were not destroyed, it is clear and obvious that we as firstborn are special. And in fact, they went on to initially to be the ones who were supposed to serve in the temple. Eventually, it was transferred to the priests. But initially, it was going to be the firstborn of Israel were sanctified, as it reads in this week's portion, sanctified to me all firstborn people, animals, firstborn fruit. Everything firstborn was meant to be sanctified. That was the vision of Moses, to create a firstborn mentality. It failed, though. And eventually it went to the priests. But the idea of being a firstborn and being special comes immediately after, as you can see in the text, the idea that certain firstborn survive and certain don't. And if you don't survive, you weren't deserving. And if you do survive, you were deserving. Now, how much more do you need to know than understanding the mentality of a community that believes that dying for God's sake is the highest way to end? And if you live, you can now prove that you were chosen once again for God's mission. Now it makes sense to me. They're not committing murder. It's just ritual sacrifice. It's just sanctifying God's name in a blaze of glory of either death or survival. Well, if you felt that way, if you felt that if you survive COVID, it will be proof of God's will and ordination of you. If you felt that way, ask yourself, would you wear a mask? Don't you want to be chosen by God? Don't you want to be known? Don't you want to know whether God wants you close up there or important down here? Don't you want to know? It's a rare opportunity. So no masks. And lots of death and tragedy. But it's all been twisted into theology. And somehow, religion yet again smooths out the bumps and makes everything okay because somehow it's all God's will. Purveyors of death and murder and hurt, once again, followers, beware of your rabbis who are willing to sacrifice you. My final thought for today takes me back to when I was a child and I was scared of dogs. I was scared of dogs for many reasons. Virtually nobody in the ultra-Orthodox community that I grew up in had a dog. I had no interaction with them other than to hear them barking or see them aggressive. I had no idea how dogs behaved and what they were. I never really interacted with dogs. My father told us about a dog he had, but that was as close as we ever got. Dogs are problematic for Orthodox families because you're not supposed to touch a dog on Shabbat or lead them on a leash. There's a lot of things you can't do. You can't brush their hair. You have problems with Passover food. You can't feed them chametz. It's challenging. Dogs are a challenge. And also, there's text in the Torah that talks about not having a bad dog or not using the money that you earn from the sale of a dog for sacred purposes. So dogs are given sort of a push out of the appropriate arena. And then there's this week's portion, in which says that the night of Passover, the Exodus Eve, God is going to protect the people. Leil Shimurim Hu. It is a protected night. And that's why we open the door at the Seder. We say it is a Leil Shimurim. We're unafraid to open our door the night of Passover. Elijah happens to come in, but that's a separate story. We open it up and we say, we're not afraid. Leil Shimurim Hu. It is a night in which we are protected. And so much so, Lo Yechratz Kelev L'shono. A dog will not even growl at you or bark at you. That's how quiet the night would be, is that the people would leave their homes for Exodus. Even the dogs wouldn't bark and wouldn't growl. So now, when I was a kid and scared of dogs, we had a problem. How do you get home from school or walk anywhere when there's dogs everywhere? It's a scary thing. So we were told that all we had to do when we were confronted by a dog or we heard a dog is say, Ulachol b'nei Yisrael yechratz kelev l'shono. And to all the children of Israel, a dog will not growl or bark. That's all we had to do. Can you imagine going home from school and every time I heard a dog bark, I'd say, Ulachol b'nei Yisrael yechratz kelev l'shono. Sometimes the dogs just stopped barking. Sometimes they didn't. But every time they did, it reinforced the belief that we had just done something important. We had just stopped the dogs from barking. Well, good memories of bygone days, but let me tell you, I would have rather had someone say to me, instead of learning a pasuk, a verse, in how to teach the dogs to back off, we're going to bring in a dog for you to learn how to engage with, and you won't be scared of dogs anymore. The difference between a community that wants fear to prevail so that theology and text and Torah and God become the primary driver for everything you do, which is ultimately what creates power and destruction like we're seeing now, is to keep people afraid and use a verse to shield them from fear. In my world, and hopefully in yours, what you should do is take the fear that exists in the verse and learn to engage with fear. Learn how to talk to dogs. Learn how to react to dogs. Learn how to understand dogs. Befriend a dog. Play with a dog. Learn about dogs. And then you know what happens? You don't need a verse to get you through. You have faith in yourself. You have faith in nature. You have faith in humanity. You have faith in knowledge. It's no longer out of fear. It's out of science. It's out of knowledge. And that makes for healthy people. May our fellow Jews be blessed with the wisdom to understand that their selfishness is killing other people. Killing other people, and that their disregard of law and science ultimately will destroy their communities. And while they will turn it into proof that they have been chosen, they are survivors, they are God's anointed, they were specifically left here for a purpose, while that is the case, we will not agree. We will always think of them as having used fear to make theology triumph, when in fact, they could have used knowledge to make love triumph. We'll be back shortly with Yortzites.